Hey y'all, here it is, the third and final video of list season, and honestly, one of the ones I've been the most excited to make. While the best hits of the year highlighted some of the pop tunes I casually spun, and my top songs of the year unpacked some of the not so fun emotional baggage I held, this one's just gonna be what it says on the tin. Music I loved, albums that gave color and brightness and meaning to my days. Because outside of the charts, 2024 was a great year for music. I listened to a lot more of it than usual, true, but that's because there was just so much goodness to discover, and from many different sectors of the scene. If you've been watching my videos, you might already have a good idea of what to expect, but if not, well, hi. I hope you can take at least a couple recommendations from the spread I got here, which, by the way, this was initially going to be a top 20 like last year, but honestly, I had way too many multiple way ties for my own sanity, and opted instead to single out my top 15 with some honorable mentions. And honestly, take these picks in any order you choose. Pick your favorite few and make it a top 20. Remove the top 5 to make it a top 10 with even more honorable mentions. Sure, whatever works. I really enjoyed a lot of what I listened to varying unique degrees, and my ranking, as always, is loose and malleable. Finally, I just want to go ahead and do the old YouTube thing of asking y'all to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to my channel. I have cool things cooking up for 2025, and if you love good music enough to watch this video, you're gonna enjoy what else I got coming. In any case, let's go ahead and talk about some of that good music. Starting off with my honorable mentions. Yeah, violence. Okay, in spite of this record's unapologetic messiness, I absolutely cannot knock the ambition. And Stomach Book has been one of my most fascinating discoveries this year. And the material matches with the sound, as the artist so brazenly tackles topics such as death, interpersonal violence, and transphobia. Even still, she pushes past the roughness to give us a healthy handful of some seriously neat jams, quite a few of which have been on regular rotation for me. It's a type of record that I don't think was ever going to make the list proper, but god is it such a cool little anomaly nonetheless. It's the return of the lush, atmospheric shoegaze hours. And okay, I'll admit that this one doesn't really break any new ground in its particular field. A few nice melodies, some pleasing rises and falls, and then it takes its bow. What's also true, however, is that I'm an absolute sucker for really, really pretty music, and that's what this is. This musician is just so good at wringing out every drop of the deepest emotions from each of these notes, from tender romance to soaring self-examination, and even some easygoing rock vibes. Perhaps it is a bit aimless, perhaps some of the threads it reveals are never totally tied off. I still say it's a super solid debut and a cool sign of greater things to come.
The chances all are left are might be hiding their tricks up my sleeve. Used to be.
It's taken me so long to pinpoint the appeal of Jessica Pratt, why her music has mystified and amazed me for as many years as it has. After a few listens to Hearing the Pitch, I think I finally get it. It's classic pop music that sounds like it had come from a whole different universe entirely, which, yeah, this analysis makes all that more sense after a certain other album this year came across my radar, but we'll get to that. Through less than half an hour, Pratt doesn't really pivot in many unique sonic directions, thus the songs do tend to blend together in my brain. But that's not a huge setback when the music just sounds so good, with lush acoustics, simple melodies, and a voice that is equal parts eerie and angelic. I will listen to absolutely anything she puts out at this point. Beth Gibbons' haunting voice has always been an absolute pleasure to encounter, whether it be within her work in Portishead or as a feature credit on a Kendrick Lamar track. This year, however, she finally gave us her second album, and it's just as remarkable as I was hoping. It's an album that is largely defined by the passing of years, namely in lieu of loved ones lost in its wake, and the urgent need to find meaning in life amidst such loss. With an experienced hand, and through lush instrumentals and a beating heart that pushes and pulls the intensity as she sees fit, she attempts to draw out the fragmented beauty of life itself in all its escalating tension, as well as its still quietness. And I say she succeeds really, really well.
Then patterns in repeat can begin.
And now for the third in the unintentional trilogy of art pop by middle-aged women. Hey, if I can't put Kate Bush in my best list, here's the next best thing. Seriously though, I've been a fan of Laura Marley's music for about a decade, and it's been a pleasure watching her delicate folk stylings form into its own character and seemingly grow alongside her own stages in life. Patterns and Repeat specifically is a beautiful homage to her baby daughter, with lullaby-like melodies that shine just as much as the resplendent chamber folk instrumentation surrounding it. I'm a little past the style of folk at this point in my life, but that doesn't mean it can't still make my heart swell oh so much. There's no denying that the folks behind Frico are quite young, and one could say that they've yet to completely carve out an identity of their own, a Frico sound, if you will. For now, they've opted for similar sounds, feelings, and textures from their inspirations. A little Arcade Fire here, some Leonard Cohen there, etc. However, it's also a testament to their strengths that the strongest points of this record can nonetheless affect me so emotionally, despite the familiarity of their gestures. It's the kind of album that I wanted to make as a youngster, back when rock music still felt fresh and thrilling. At the very least, this is an excellent sign of things to come. Looking forward to where they go from here.
So how can I play this game?
This is just one of the most plainly pleasant albums I've listened to this year. If you've ever experienced a road trip or picnic soundtracked by some classic soft rock playing on some nearby stereo, the Lemon Twigs have essentially bottled up that experience and packaged it in album form. They nail that 70s power pop sound to a T, that much is true, but they also have the compositions to back it up, and so many of these tracks feel like near classics in their own right. It does suffer from that issue of too much filler that also accompanies a number of old albums of the day, but its highs also demonstrate just how much juice these guys are working with, and that's worth keeping an eye on them for the golden years to come. Man, talk about an album that I really wanted to love, just based on how strongly I felt about the singles leading up to it. Foxing really nailed it out of the park with these, and yet the rest of the album is just pretty darn good. Not exceptional, but really solid. I did go back and listen to some of their back catalog afterwards, and yeah, there's a considerable amount of growth here, both in the emotional breadth and complexities of their instrumentals, as well as their themes of societal alienation and disillusionment, the weight of which can be practically felt in every single note they play. I definitely recommend this album to anyone looking for a solid slice of emotional indie rock from last year. It's supremely solid, for sure.
I don't miss my mind. Doctors and nurses. Tingling.
Is there a person in the world cooler than Kim Gordon? I don't think so. Gordon had already made a name for herself as a long-standing member of the literal Sonic Youth, but with the collective, she proves that she is more than just this label. The album sounds and feels to me like the very concept of subversion, taking all the familiar aspects of noise, industrial, experimental rock, and yes, trap music, and twisting it around each other until it becomes an unrecognizable blob, and then turning that blob into its own unique definition of neat and groovy entirely. I don't know if that description makes any sense, but this album intentionally defies any clean categorization anyway. It's just so very cool. Not cool for a 70-year-old woman, mind you, just cool.
Now I do you suppose you must approach the throne with its back up against the wall.
I almost decided to leave this one out of the video entirely, but I wanted to round out to a solid 10 HMs, so here we are. I already knew going into Mahash Mashana that I'd enjoy it as much as I do most other Father John Misty albums, i.e. some pretty strong tracks, but some others I don't care about nearly as much. And yeah, that's pretty much the case with this album. Although I decided to prioritize my favorite tracks on this one because man do I love them. Easily among Josh Tillman's very best, from the lush spaciousness of its opener to the production experimentation strewn throughout the rest. Perhaps I haven't fully jumped on board with its damn near universal praise, at least not yet. But I definitely see where everyone else is coming from, yeah. And I think that's a good place to move on, so let's do exactly that, as I present to you all my top 15 best albums of 2024.
Vai chegando o fim, acertando a tua lente.
I feel like there's no better way to kick off my top 15 than with a record that was probably the first one I truly loved this year. Kristen Dezio's Acelero is insane. The first track instantly felt like a solid dead ringer for the Death Grip sound, and then, as if the artist sensed I had settled into this mode of comfortability, swiftly yanked me out of it throughout the rest of the record. It's tempting to slot this in with the rest of the eccentric Brazilian funk scene, which, if you didn't know, there are some wild things going on with the music in Brazil right now.
Território, território. Tenho pensado muito sobre território, como me comporto em cada território.
And yet, I'm not even a little bit Brazilian, so take my word with grau de sal. But there's just so much color and vibrancy so thickly spread throughout this record. Some hip-hop here, some techno there, a faint touch of EDM, some death metal growls for the hell of it. All led off by those dominant tropical rhythms that keep me dancing until I drop. I've never previously heard of this artist, nor do I know what his deal is, or if he even has another good record under his belt. But for a brief flash in the midst of this chaotic year, he gave us some of the best music for me to get completely loose to. Hell yeah. As much as I love a really good and focused 40-minute album, or even the occasional sprawling symphonic epic, what I don't come across as often is a kind of record that burns bright, hard, and fast, departing just as swiftly as it came, but leaving a hell of an impact in the process. And I think that just about sums up the base appeal for Melt Banana's first album in 11 years. At a sharp 24 minutes long, sure, it's here in an instant and gone in a flash, but that just means I can replay it as many times as my delicate brain sees fit, and you sure as hell bet I did. From Yasuko Onuki's chirping vocals to the mind-bending guitar flourishes haphazardly scattered throughout, this never fails to be quite the wild ride, from start to finish. And yet, besides being as loud and punkish as it does so with an impressive amount of density, with shredding instrumentals that always straddle that precarious line between glitch and noise rock, with some post-hardcore leanings thrown in for good measure. It fluctuates between all of these sounds and absolutely vibrates as it does so. Truly a rollicking good time, and one that I'm ever grateful to have gotten to this year. Upon my first listen to Couch Sluts' You Can Do It Tonight earlier this year, I said it was very likely the most uncompromising album of the year up to that point. 8 months later, and yeah, I can hardly think of anything else I listened to that would compete for that title. The environment formulated in the confines of this record is rough, grimy, very intentionally unsettling, certainly fitting for the gutter punky lyrical themes of violence, drug abuse, and sexual assault that runs throughout the album. And that's precisely why it's gotten such a goddamn tight grip on me this whole year through. Between the dirty sludge of these guitar and bass riffs and Megan Ostracit's relentless wails running track after track, it very loudly displays the darkest, ugliest corners of society, along with the vivid narratives of those usually cast aside for the sake of good taste. By observing them here, we can no longer turn a blind eye to the horrors of the world, especially as it spits directly in our face. We can always use more albums that are willing to display themselves as unpretty as this one has. Hell yes. Deep Sage is an album that, through every facet of its being, absolutely shreds. This certainly describes these guitars for sure, which oscillate from riff after chunky, churning riff, each one shifting into a whole entire new version of criminally catchy each and every time. But Shreds also describes the performance of vocalist Christina Michelle, who loudly juts against these aforementioned riffs in a fierce and feverish competition for space. And while the thematic material doesn't necessarily break any new ground in its post-hardcore portrayal of burning angst and fierce hostility, it does so across a splendid collection of some of the greatest jams I've heard all year long.
And if you stab me in the chest over again, you'd expect me.
Seriously, I constantly struggle with singling out my true favorite tracks of this record. Nearly all of them are great and catchy in ways completely unique to them. And placing Jack Shirley in charge of production, who I mostly recognize for his similarly splendid dynamism across Jeff Rosenstock's work, that ended up being the secret ingredient to make all of these tracks really pop off in their own special ways. Not too bad for a band who were on the brink of a breakup before reuniting for this record. Perhaps some of these sour emotions influenced the sound, but we sure got one of the most blistering records of the year as a result. And That's just so cool.
Baby, you know that time can take you for a ride, can take you by surprise, maybe you're
Let's change things up a bit. It's taken me a little bit of pondering to come to this conclusion, but at least for me, I've decided that The Past is Still Alive is Alinda Segarra's best album. Sure, there's nothing here that hits quite as hard as Palante, but God is the vision on this record so beautifully realized, both in the tender, heartfelt acoustic numbers and in the lively mid-tempo rockers. The sound drawn here feels steeped in opulent country tradition, which elevates its equally as rich thematic material as Segarra draws out the minute details of the numerous lifetimes cast aside by common society, humanizing these voices in the meantime. These are the types of people defined by their lifetime of struggle, and through these words and music, we reveal the unquenchable thirst and unbreakable walls of the human spirit, further demonstrating that there truly is no battle that cannot be won.
Tell me why, what don't it look like? I'm always crying.
And it does all this while remaining as richly poetic as ever, giving us what seems like endless sprawls of evocative imagery, which carve out the lives that make up the bulk of these songs. I always knew Segarra was a terrific storyteller, but this album only further demonstrates the extent of their strengths, and it's never a dull moment giving it a listen. Don't be fooled by how low I've ranked this. It really is one of the most important albums we got on this whole list, that much is certain.
Evaporate. He sang the song of the lake, the song of...
I said this before during my initial review of Wild God, but I do think it bears repeating how absolutely touched I am that someone who's very publicly experienced great loss and pain can nonetheless make such a life-affirming album out of the healing process. And indeed, this album is a very real, often painful reminder that these two states of mind often share much of the same energetic space. Above some of the most mournful chords I've heard all year long, Nick Cave will croon about how he feels as lively as a frog or a rabbit. And among some of the album's most blissful moments, he sounds like he could damn near start sobbing at any moment.
Bring your spirit down.
I've listened to most of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds discography at this point, and while this has very little of that wild-eyed frenzy that characterized much of their past material, it seemed to have been replaced with a new lease on life, a more mature sound, a mournful acknowledgement of what has been lost, and an optimistic look at the future, no matter what may lie there. It's undoubtedly one of the most beautiful albums I've heard all year long, a terrific inclusion to Nick Cave's storied collection of high art.
The last thing said when we lay in bed is that I love when you invoke my death, when the gray gauze mist descends.
I swear, I often forget that Los Campesinos are, indeed, Welsh. I mean, I'm certainly reminded of this when I look backwards at the material that introduced me to the band in the late aughts, with a sound and lyrical tradition that stems directly from the bratty, energetic British garage rock scene at the time. But now, we're over a decade and a half in the future, and boy does the music reflect that. Much of the energy is still present in All Hell. The hooks are certainly sharp as hell, but they're accompanied by this much more morose tone that's reflected the utter exhaustion of all that's unraveled in that time.
An ocean house upon collapsing stilts, a breaker coming.
And like I said, with how much these lyrics about the frustrations of the current world, the failure of capitalism to provide for its people, the efforts we must take to reach out to one another for support in these days, the triumphs hidden in the little corners of the everyday, yeah, I do forget that they're not American, which only really speaks to the sad universality of their words. And yet, it also speaks to how important these words are to so many of us, despite the borders, perhaps even more than ever now. And boy am I ever glad to have this album around as we continue to fight for humanity in the long road ahead of us.
And I failed statistics, but I A6 said, oh, said life would have roadblocks. Now bitch, you a square, you Roblox. Won the Super Bowl with my hands behind my...
Alright, I have no way to justify not only placing this album on this list in general, but also putting it as high as I have. On the surface, this should be so grating to me specifically. Nerdy white boy rap really isn't up my alley at all. I cannot stand epic rap battles of history, or most comedy rap in general. Nonetheless, in the case of No Hands, it all boils down to one important thing. This album is so damn fun. First of all, this production is so good. The beats are incredibly vibrant, cherry picking from a wider variety of genres than expected. Some drum and bass influence, a little jazz, even some 90s punk in there, all helping to make each track stand out in its own special way.
Ooh, I guess I don't care. I feel like Michael Cera in his swag era. What I got won't share up. You gotta linger.
But even more crucially is that Joey Valance and Bray genuinely just sound like a couple of cool, fun dudes, with their bars refreshingly lacking in that chauvinistic, misogynistic attitudes that make up way too much of this similar sphere of nerd rap. On the contrary, they're just here to flex their self-confidence by way of their rich arsenal of knowingly corny one-liners, and I can't help but want to party along with them. I came into this record enjoying this new wave of Beastie Boys-esque coolness, but they've long transcended this comparison at this point. I've greatly enjoyed having this in my regular rotation, and I can't wait to keep the party going for as long as I can. It feels almost foolish of me to say that I wish this were a more complete album, because indeed, this would have been a very easy top 3 pick if it was more satisfying, perhaps if there were some more tracks to fill in the empty spaces. But again, this is foolish, because how the hell could I not be more than content with the totally wide scale of noise and color and texture all along this album? Hakushi Hasegawa is a truly inventive artist in a near literal sense, as their music sounds like it's simply burst into thin air, like some magic spell. Likewise, Mahogako is an entire universe of music, a playful subversion of both jazz and pop conventions, effortlessly interweaved and re-emerging as something entirely new and exciting. Stepping into the confines of this record feels like floating on a cloud, encountering strange animals you've never seen before, taking a sip of the clearest, coldest water you've ever tasted in your life. It's music that's equal parts abrasive, strange, and gorgeous, just as willing to remind you of the universal terrors in life as it is to pull out the hidden beauty that lies within each passing moment. Like I said at the start, I do wish there was a bit more cohesion to the whole record, but given that it's a remarkable step in a whole new direction for the artist, I say a little shakiness is understandable, even welcome. I mean, what's life for if not reaching for untold ambition and soaring in ways never before attempted? That's what makes it so damn fun, after all. Despite all the varied directions my changing tastes have taken over the decades, I do take a special opportunity here and there to return back to the Decemberists. And there's only one word I can use to describe their style. Well, actually, I could use several, but Colin Malloy's got me more than covered, I bet. Anyway, the word is theatrical. Whether their music is steeped in historical context or some obscure mythical folklore, it's always wrapped firmly with the sensation of being transported to a whole other world from centuries in the past. And this album is one of my favorites of the year when it comes to this. Just a wide range of eclectic storytelling and organic instrumentation that never grows stale from track to track.
America made me so American.
And yet, I'll also go out on a limb and say it's one of their best, period, or at least one of their most mature. With the pronounced poignancy to these songs, I've seldom heard from them before. And the music is really good, sure, but I'm mostly impressed by the tightness of everything here, where no note or syllable seems the slightest out of place, with no sacrifice to the inner fanciful tendencies of the group overall. Simply put, it's a really cool album, everything I could ever want in a Decemberist record, and then some. In spite of all the ways I've changed through the years, I'm always gonna have a soft spot for this band, and I'm so glad they've continued to make my commitment to their art so very worthwhile. I feel like each year I come across that one hardcore or metal album that stands out to me in some way, even above all the other hardcore and metal releases of the year. 2023 gave me Svalbard, while 2022 was occupied by the 1-2 punch of Soul Glow and Wormrot. Man, that was a wild year, huh? Anyway, even with as much as I listened to this year, even with some of those harder albums I talked about earlier, I knew that there was very little that was going to beat out this one for me. Children of the Moon just plain crushes. The instrumentation is so tightly produced, it's almost sparkling, with tremendous guitar riffs spread across each tumultuous track, including the occasional rip-roaring solo. And that's before we get to these vocals, seething screams which constantly feel right on the edge of ripping through the sound barrier entirely. They're so intense. And yet, it's not always about the intensity. There are plenty of cooldown moments here that never weigh the album down in any particular way. Rather, they're used as breathers of sorts before we get right back to that old visceral pummel. I don't really know what else to say about this one. I think I'm experienced enough that I know terrific hardcore when I hear it, and this was always bound to hit me right in my little black heart. Amazing stuff. Alright, I did say that very little would have beat out State Fault for Hardcore Album of the Year for me, and here's what beat it. Though, yes, it is unfair to even compare these two. State Fault is riffy, melodic, absolutely soaring, while Chat Pile is decidedly not. And okay, listen, I'm not a lover of sludge metal by any means. For the most part, it sounds so drab to my ears and all tends to run together for me. Nonetheless, Chat Pile seem to have absolutely nailed it with their second album. Sludge metal with a beating heart right at the center of its dissonant atonal chords, and it's pissed off as all hell. Pissed off at the world, our local governments, the structures of it all, the general inhumanity of things. The band had previously made a name for themselves with their raw as hell presentation of these aforementioned anxieties all throughout their debut, but I think Cool World has the emotional weight of their sound that much more sharpened. It's still as angry and brooding as ever, the despairing vocals and the 2-ton heavy riffs defining their sound as much as ever before. But, well, the songs are richer, more plentiful in social commentary, and even the occasional tune here and there. And like I said before, I do sense more of a heady thrust behind the album. It's not as bleak and nihilistic as it is a sobering reflection of the mass violence and corruption that surrounds us, the constant fatigue of the so-called cool world in which we live. At the very least, we can always escape into the dark. Being totally honest, I would have been completely satisfied with an album of damn near any quality to call the last one from The Cure. I mean, Robert Smith and gang have given us 4.5 decades of some of the finest recorded music of all time, and they've also released some less than stellar works along the way. A passable album would have been just fine enough. But Songs of a Lost World is more than just passable. It's a fantastic love letter to their storied career and the personal lives they tied into it. They approach this final bow not as a bandage to tear off hurriedly, but as a huge, luxurious linger, almost an infatuation with the end of things, not unlike the love affair with death they've carried on their whole career.
I'm down on my knees, empty inside.
And on that note, man, do they take their time here, allowing each and every track, even the shorter ones, to unfurl itself in such splendid glory. And in doing so, unraveling some of the most beautiful contemplations of grief and mortality of the band's whole lifespan. And I think the languid pace of this record speaks so much to what I valued in music and in life this past year. There comes a point when you realize there's just no use in hurrying each moment along to move on to the next one. Rather, we should be taking in our precious lives one deliciously prolonged second at a time. No one truly knows when they'll have to sing their own end song, so might as well make each fleeting moment count as much as it deserves, while we still can.
I don't know what I do, don't know what I do without you.
Yep, here we are again. I think this is the 5th, maybe 6th time I've talked about this album, or songs from this album on my channel, and I fear I might be retreading past words. Yet, I don't think that'll be the case. For one thing, this record deserves all the praise it gets. For my money, it's likely Adrienne Lenker's best album so far, each song a small look into her artistry and history in the best, most beautiful ways possible. But also, there's a bit more than meets the eye here. Sure, this is a beautifully arranged record with a collection of some of the most tender folk and country tunes to come out this whole year.
You show me understanding, patience and pleasure.
But ultimately, the magic comes in Lenker's extremely poignant lyricism, particularly her faultless ability to speak truth to some of the most universal yet oft-hidden emotions, whether it's the grieving of a relationship's end, the whirlwind of queer romance, or the futile longing for a parent's love. And yes, it's love that ultimately serves as the glue for the whole record. The pain and beauty of love. Love as the grandest of life's emotions, and also the smallest of passing instances. And it's these particular kernels of beauty that Linker grasps onto and illuminates by way of some of the most gorgeous harmonies and instrumental turns of the year. I swear, I feel like my mind and body have been absolutely shattered throughout the many times I've come back to this record, and also put back together again through the sheer strength of Linker's position as storyteller, confidant, friend. Its tranquility as an art form. I appreciate loudness and maximalism as much as the next weirdo, but this delicate kind of intimacy is something that's so precious and hard to come by in this day and age. And when I see it, you best believe I'm going to take hold of it like my life depends on it. I needed this album this year, and I'm so happy it exists. Alright, I've been saying all year long that this is going to be a segment I'll have to write eventually, and no matter what, I'm never going to be satisfied with it. Maybe I'll retread these waters again in about 5 years and use that wisdom to make a better, more thoughtful review. Seriously, with how huge of a spot this album has taken in my heart, I simply don't feel cut out for this, at all. Nonetheless, I'm also the only person capable of writing about what this album means to me, so let's just take that approach.
I just told them take it easy and let me through.
To be fair, I doubt I'm the only person who struggled to crack into the shell of this record. Nearly every review of Diamond Jubilee I've read, including the positive ones, have tended to approach this album less as a work of art and more of an artifact, choosing to focus primarily on external qualities of its existence. Its unconventional choice of accessibility, its meaty 2-hour length, the history of Pat Fiegel's involvement with their previous band Women, a mere glossing over of what the record offers at a surface level, and yes, this is a very cool album just on those own merits. The way Flegel utilizes aspects of classic brill building techniques and tropes of 60s pop, rock and roll, and even country, remorphing these familiar sounds like Play-Doh and covering it all in the haze of tearful nostalgia. That's basically what helped me love this album in the first place.
There were times that I knew for sure
It's essentially everything I love about music in one giant chunk of space. Fuzzed out soundscapes, nostalgic longing, androgynous vocals, and the queer subtext as well, which could take up an entire essay's length of time on its own. Let's put a pin in that one. But, well, I've listened to hundreds of albums through the years, and I can say with certainty that Diamond Jubilee is one of the very few that I felt absolutely indebted to. The one that I constantly felt the intense need to keep revisiting, as if, despite how much I genuinely enjoyed each visit, I needed to keep unraveling the experience. For the longest time, I had no idea why I seemed so drawn to re-listening again and again. Yeah, the sound is great, Flegel's guitar work is mesmerizing, and the songs are psychedelic, but also catchy in that very classic Phil Spector meets Ricky Nelson sort of way. But it is just a sound anyway, and these are just love songs. And no, I don't think that Pitchfork giving it its highest rating in 4 years is enough to get me so intensely on board. I'm not that much of a sheep, y'all. But here's the thing, none of that is the point. The uniformity of its sound, the repetition of its themes, the hazed out feeling of the whole thing, these are just additional aspects to the album's character, but the character itself remains. There is no song on here that is as good as the experience of taking in the record in its entirety. I stand extremely firm on that. And because of that, yeah, it's such an intimidating record. There's very little here that offers any compromise to the listener, all the way down to its utter rejection of convenient streaming models and physical availability. But it's also a very human record, just a quaint collection of tunes made from the heart of Cindy Lee themselves, and also so much bigger than that. Throughout Throughout the album, Lee laments on lost loves, painful desolation, and existential dread. The language they use is mundane, but absolutely comprehensive, encapsulating the turmoiled human experience in ways to which damn near anyone can relate. And just as much as they speak to this universality of existence, they also breathe life back into these long-gone genres toward which they pay homage, as well as the countless people who built them. It's an album that attempts, perhaps futilely, to capture the expanse of a century's worth of art and music in a 2-hour time frame, which doesn't seem quite so long anymore now, does it?
You don't have to take it for the moon and
And yeah, that's kind of where it all trickles down. Time. There's just never enough time for anything, and the time we do have flashes by far too quickly to manage. Decades fold into one another seamlessly, and the innovation in 20th century's music that once seemed so fresh and new and exciting are now considered classics, pushed way to the back of history's timeline, only ever to be revived again through a series of fabricated memories. And now we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century. Therefore, well, this album offers me the luxury I never really considered that I needed. The luxury to stop time, to press play and allow myself to simply sit and smolder into what feels like an expanse stretching eternities. I obviously know this isn't the case, and as soon as the album's over, I'm back to the real world again. But, well, it's always nice having a friend with whom to spend some time forgetting about your worries, and I'll say that's what Diamond Jubilee has been for me, when I needed it, most of all. And there we have it, one of the most beautifully daunting albums I've ever come across, and I don't think I've even begun to do it justice here. In any case, this is just coming from the brain of someone who's listened to this album at least 15 times and loved every single second. And who knows, maybe in 5 years I won't even love this album as much, knowing how frivolous my tastes have been through the years. Whatever the case, it's been quite the magical experience having this take up as much of my life as it has this past year, and I can think of no better album to have done so. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, take care, and I'll see you next time.